Well, we're excited to start a new segment. It's called Raise the Rural Vote. Now, this election year, your vote matters more to Washington than ever before, and we want to seize the moment. It's an opportunity to bring greater awareness to the issues facing rural Americans like you while we have Washington's ear. Now, we don't want to get into the candidates, but we do want to spotlight the issues that matter to you. And our first comment comes from Brett and Rhonda Sterling.
We are ranchers from Wyoming, and calves are selling for 50% less than 5 years ago. We know that no one in the beef production chain is making money except the packers and the retailers. How can we draw more attention to this problem before it is the demise of the independent cattle industry?
And joining us now to shed some light on what's happening in the beef production chain and how we can get this message to those who need to hear it while they're listening right now in Washington. We have Ethan Lane with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association joining us. Thank you so much for taking some time with us, Ethan. And let's start with the numbers and the trends that we've seen in the beef production chain impacting independent cattle producers, specifically over the last 5 years.
You bet. I appreciate you having me on. You know, this is something that obviously we are spending a lot of time here in D.C. talking about. Our producers are coming home from the sale barn with a lot less money in their pocket than they were hoping for. And you know, looking at that 5-year trend line, I think that the most important thing we need to focus on is the idea that inventory in that 2014-15 range was far lower than it is today. We've really rebuilt herds over the last few years. And that supply and demand metric really has a downward force on the market when our processing capacity hasn't changed. So we have consumer demand increasing, which is helping out that packing and retail sector. And we have more cattle in the system than we had 5 years ago, which produces that lower calf price that we hate to see for our members across the country. You know, we hear CattleFax and others telling us that inventory is leveling off this year and that we're going to see some contraction over the next year or two, and maybe even that picking up steam a little bit. And that's the market sending those signals back down through the value chain that you know, maybe it's time to trim back a little bit and raise that per calf price at the sale barn. So we're going to be watching those numbers. At the same time, we're continuing to expand those foreign markets so that we can create more demand internationally and put a little more pressure on the packing sector to add capacity. You know, whether that's through new plants, which we know don't happen overnight, or you know, additional shifts at the plants they have, which they have a lot of challenges with labor to help that along as well. So it's a difficult equation, but you know, as we look at those numbers and look for opportunities to clear roadblocks, it's something we hope we're going to see some improvement in the next year.
Absolutely. Really happy to hear that. I'm sure a lot of the small-scaler operations are happy to hear that as well. But you know what? When you are one of the little guys in this ag industry, sometimes you feel like you can yell at the top of your lungs and no one's listening. How can cattle ranchers who may share this sentiment, the same sentiment as Brett and Rhonda Sterling, who we heard from, how can they raise their voice and really get this message to Washington while they're listening?
Well, you know, I think that they do that pretty well. We spend most of our time in the D.C. office talking to those producers on the ground. I mean, it's how we spend our time. It's where we take our direction. Talking to their members of Congress, talking to us. The policies that come up through the policy process at NCBA that give my team in D.C. our direction on Capitol Hill, that's where we spend most of our time. You know, talking about the waters of the United States, Endangered Species Act, NEPA and grazing regs for those Western producers that are impacted by those regulations. Clearing those roadblocks so that it's easier to produce cattle on the ground is where we spend the vast majority of our time here in D.C. And it's been a year full of really big wins on that front. But those wins only come because our producers are telling their members of Congress what's important to them and where they need help. That gives us the ability to go reinforce that and find some strategic ways to log to those victories for the industry here on Capitol Hill. It takes the whole industry pushing together because obviously we are outgunned by some of these urban communities often in these D.C. conversations.
We really appreciate the work that you are doing on the ground in the nation's capital. National Cattlemen's Beef Association Government Affairs Vice President Ethan Lane, thank you so much for joining us.